Welcome to Sojourner. It's hosted by yours truly, and I'm the pastor of Gracenet Community Church, if you didn't know that already, in Wellington, New Zealand. And each week I am joined on this great sojourn of mine by one of a few different co-hosts, usually around three, kind of dropped down to two these days. But Nick Cleveley is joining me today, and he's, as you know, one of the regular guys on the show. He's the pastor of Grace, Covenant of Grace Baptist Church in Timaru, and you can get him at his website there. I'll have that on the show notes. And then just to say also, the music on the podcast was written by Jeremy Casella, and that's Indelible Grace. And you can listen to them on Spotify, so go check them out. Also, go check out our website at 2agesojourner.com, where we try and keep it basically up to date. And give us a rating, for crying out loud, if you like the show. And give us money too if you want. Send us a donation. I'll send you my bank account. You can throw it straight in there. But in all seriousness, here we are. And sorry about last week. If you were tracking with us on that baptism thing, I was sick, so I bailed. It's my fault. But we had some great feedback, even though it was such a, I thought, quite a lame discussion.
Obviously the hot topic.
Yeah, it's a perennial issue, isn't it? But we're keen to get back at it and just talk a little bit more about Greg Welty's article. Just keep the feedback coming. I'm just racking it up. I'm just storing it in this one giant folder, and we'll get to it eventually. But yeah, I've appreciated some of the things people have said in that. We've just, I think one of the things that was appreciated was just the way in which there are more than just, one particular Reformed Baptist-ish view. You've got a whole bunch of them to look at there, and just some of the nuance. But that said, I know many requests to actually interact with 1689 federalism, so we'll get there. Of course, we have to. I mean, now it's on the map, and we will. Trust me. But let's cover the basics first. And really, as much as I want to, interact with that, it's like I'm not on a crusade to, get a pound of flesh from the 1689 Federalists. I just really want an opportunity to flesh out a little bit more of our own view. And as far as that will interact naturally with the 1689 federal view, I mean, be good to do. I think particularly on things like the Abrahamic covenant and so forth when we get there, and we'll just bring it up as there are any nuances that come up. And I know there's Sam Renihan's just done some recent stuff that I've kind of had an opportunity to check out, but a few links have been thrown my way to have a look at that. It looks really good. So we'll just do that. We'll go through those articles, and Nick and I will just take it low and slow, the way we always like to do. All right, Nick, you're looking fancy on Skype, bro. We've got a new background.
My new camera. Dude, I ordered it during lockdown, and it arrived like last week.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, we're on Skype. That's always a risky biz, but let's hope it works. Sure. Now, what I've wanted to do, or what I've asked you to do, is just because you did have a look at that whole article. I still haven't gone around to actually looking at it, so I will benefit from this discussion as much as anyone listening right now. It sort of takes me back to our patriarchal discussions, just, just go with it. But yeah, you're the resident expert on Welty, so let's have it, bro. What's happening?
I'm the recently read person on Welty.
Well, in my book, that's expertise right there.
Alrighty. So what we were doing is we were just beginning to look at the whole issue of the problems of continuity and discontinuity, and the Judaizing of the New Testament and the Christianizing of the Old Testament. And we began last time to look at Jeremiah 31. Now what we're doing is we're just sort of continuing to look at just some of those problem verses that really just highlight the problem that they have in these two areas. So we've looked at Jeremiah 31. What I want to look at next is John 1, verse 11 to 13. And what I've got here, I haven't got the verses. If anyone wants to grab the verses and read along, they're welcome to. I've just got a few summaries, notes that I took reading Welty's article. So John 1, verse 11 to 13, Jesus came to those who were already considered children of God in the Old Testament sense. And what we mean by the Old Testament sense is there's an Old Testament view of adoption where Israel is the son of God, as reflected in Hosea 11, verse 1 and Romans 9, 2 to 4. Namely, he came to his own, the Jews. But John 1:11-13 indicates a change in who is now the adopted son of God. It's those who believe, not those born of believing parents. They're described as born of God, not of their parents. The Old Testament allowed for people who were not born of God to be called adopted and belonging to him. The New Testament changes that. So this is just an area where they have been too flat in their reading, moving from the Old to the New. And that's just a key verse which highlights the shortfall of their view.
Man. Yeah, I think, and just maybe before we go on as well, I mean, I see Welty's got a few points here on Jeremiah, and I'm almost convinced we didn't cover anywhere near enough ground.
Oh, no, definitely. So we'll have to recover that.
We'll have to come back to Jeremiah. So just relax if you are looking at this thinking, what the heck am a jack, So Jeremiah is huge, though. I mean, it really is, and there is a lot to talk about there. But we're just
we said so much last week. I thought, we'll let Jeremiah rest and get on to the other verses.
We'll come back to it. Yeah, for sure. That's a good move. Now, this is an interesting one. This John 1. It's big for me. I really do. I feel like this is one of the massive things that happens. Just recently I'm preaching through the Gospels, in overview form at least. But, I spent 5 years in the Gospels, going through that very carefully. And, these were these little moments, where it struck me again and again how this is the thing that's changed. This is the number one thing when set against, especially the religious leaders of Israel. I mean, even just from John the Baptist ministry, I think we did mention that last time. Here he is laying the axe at the root. Here he is saying, listen, it's only those who are now found identified with this judgment ordeal, that are actually repenting, that are actually being baptized. Those are the ones. I mean, anyone who's holding on to their Abrahamic lineage at this point is just, toast. It's the end of the old covenant, as it were. And so even though, we know that much of the debate goes beyond the old covenant to the Abrahamic covenant, and we see a deep continuity there, as you said, is just where they're a little bit flat for us, in terms of that unfolding progression. And we're just seeing that even with that basic sense of parallel to Abraham, there's just something extra that happens by way of administration here, something closer to the nub. It's not heaven. It's not the full scaled, everyone knows the Lord, but there's something that at least reflects the reality that in the covenant of redemption, now already all know the Lord. And I don't like it when people look at this kind of passage, as Peter Baptist, and they say to us, well, how on earth, if the logic goes like this. You can never tell what's going on in someone's heart anyway. You're not God. You can't tell if someone has been born of the Spirit, and so, by that rationale, we can baptize everyone, including unbelieving babies. Do you see the big leap there?
Exactly. Wrong conclusion.
It doesn't really work like that, because we're saying that we agree that's fine. No one's trying to know anyone's heart. But we're just saying, as a result of the theological truth going on here, there is something by way of administration that at least should reflect this final stage.
100%. I mean, as the local church, we are administering the visible church, not the invisible. And so it's credible confession that we're seeking to acknowledge. So who do we know who has believed? It's those who make a confession of faith, show the fruits. Those are the ones we're going to be baptizing. But those are the ones we're going to be baptizing, not those who have no confession, who are simply born to believing parents.
Right. It's like, okay, so we can't figure out what's going in your heart, so let's get out a water pistol and just shoot everyone. It just doesn't work. No. So anyway, all right. That's
cool. So just the next verse he throws out there. So we've looked at John 1, verse 11-13. It's very much in the same vein. He looks at Romans 9, verse 2-4, and especially Romans 8, verse 15-17. And he says there, Paul notes a type of adoption and sonship that included those who could turn away and were unregenerate. So that's the Old Testament from Romans 9. The New Testament, which has a spiritual adoption that is based on election, regeneration, and the indwelling of the Spirit, these are the ones who are taught by the Spirit to say, Father, and these are the ones who cannot fall away. These are the ones who are called and will one day be glorified. And this is a different adoption, at least It's where in the Old Testament we would say that their view of adoption had those who were elect and regenerate, but also had under the title of the sons of God those who were non-elect and non-regenerate. In the New Testament, it's only the inner circle that are defined as the sons of God.
And to push the boundaries on this one, and this is where we can maybe just spin with a little Kleinianism. I don't know anyone that actually holds to this. I think I've mentioned this before, but I think it's a nice thought experiment anyway. Because it goes together with some of the apostasy passages and the debates surrounding the externality or internality of the covenant of grace, and I know for a lot of people that's what gets them to rethink the whole Baptist model. That there seems to be some sort of, despite the protestations of the Baptists, there seems to be some ongoing level of externality and ability to apostatize and turn away from that covenant status in the New Testament. Now, I think that the issue is related to baptism, but what I often say and what I often think to myself is like, well, I don't buy it, but let's say you had to just adopt a full-scale Kleinian model at that point and just go, yeah, fine. We just have an external covenant of grace, and there are among those external covenant members, those who will ultimately be, saved and show themselves ultimately saved in the covenant of redemption in eternity. Okay, that's fine. Do that. At the end of the day, it still doesn't give you, we'd just be baptizing after profession of faith anyway. And all that's proving is that, when there's an apostasy, there is an actual covenant status breaking. It still doesn't actually get at the root of whether you should baptize those prior to profession of faith or not. So, I don't know anyone that does hold that, but I just think that's helpful to throw out there just so as to not get lost in the heart of it all.
It just highlights that there's nothing putting forward the positive view of saying, therefore, baptize babies.
I know, exactly, yeah. And, it reminds me a little bit of the whole, this happens often. This is crazy. It just happened recently as I was talking to someone. Sometimes, a Peter Baptist feels if I could just get you to admit that, you're baptized, you could baptize a child, then it's over. But we have no problem baptizing children. The issue is not children. The issue is credible profession of faith.
Yes.
And it's just like sometimes that's a real mind bender, because if you don't keep that straight, it's like the argumentation just goes all over the place, and it feels like if you slam the one, it's like all of a sudden you've got this whole big argument. And I feel like a lot of the Peter Baptist literature relies on that accumulative case stuff, So you've got to keep this central issue in play so that when it is that they've made a point that you appreciate and need to think about. So even like a household baptism that involved children, that still wouldn't. That's fine. That doesn't say anything about infants at all.
The verses where it may have occurred all say they all rejoiced, they all spoke in tongues, they all believed.
No problem with kids there either, if that's what happened. Yeah, exactly. So things like that, we just have to keep straight on, and we'll bring that out as we go. So that's good.
Cool. So that's the end of the first section of Welty's article.
Okay.
Where he looks at key verses which highlight the flat readings that they have, or the wrong readings that they have. His second section looks at this issue: significant discontinuities in the meaning and function of the covenant signs. And here Welty points out the errors of the Peter Baptists in overlooking significant discontinuities in both the meaning and the function of the covenant signs. Okay, so he's going to say, yes, there's a connection between baptism and circumcision, but you're underplaying the discontinuity. You're seeing too much continuity. So first point that he makes under this heading is the meaning of the sign of circumcision is not identical to the meaning of the sign of baptism. There is overlap, but there is not parity. Okay, that's a very important statement. It's probably a statement that's quite ambiguous that everyone could probably agree on.
Yep.
But it's, how much?
Yeah, at very minimum, the Peter Baptist is going to say, well, discontinuity in the nature of the sign, where circumcision was it involved blood, it represented that blood thing that was going on all the way through.
Girls were excluded, now they're included.
Right, totally, all those actual subjects, exactly. And so everyone's admitting that at some level, it's just to what degree.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So what he does is he looks at Romans 4:11 and Colossians 2:11 and 12. And these verses, of course, hint at the connection between baptism and circumcision. There are those who refuse to see this connection. I think we are very happy to say there's definitely a progression and a connection. There's a single development going through and into the New Testament from circumcision to baptism.
Yeah, like let me stop you there and just
that must fall away.
So, like, I'm totally happy to talk about baptism as a covenant sign. That what it's the ongoing covenant sign for the administration of the covenant of grace. Are you happy with that language? I know a lot of people aren't.
I'm happy. Yeah, depending on what you mean, I would be very happy with it.
Well, what I mean, I suppose, is just that you've got, you got the two things in the new covenant, the two sacraments, right?
Visible things,
right?
Literally signs. They signify stuff.
Exactly. So it's hard to get away from, and of course you do have a profound parallel to, like the Lord's Supper, at least the Passover and circumcision, right? It's just hard to get away from that. So I know, like I mentioned that because I'm pretty sure Jewett has no problem with that language and just moving across. I'm not sure what Welty does exactly, but I think he was more or less on the same track. And then I know like everyone else almost has some weird part about this. Like, I remember reading through Fred Malone's book, and this is where it got crazy funny for me. It's like this, like they want to relate the baptism thing, at least the circumcision thing, to the sealing of the spirit and the circumcision of the heart. Yeah. And therefore, baptism is not the equivalent. You know
where I think that comes from?
Where?
John Murray.
Oh, interesting.
Because John Murray in Romans 6 talks about baptism not being anything outward, but it's the inward spiritual baptism.
Yeah. Okay, well, those guys were all drinking deeply from Murray at that point.
Yeah, so I mean, there is another view which is now prominent in Reformed circles, both in Baptist and Peter Baptist circles, where people like Sinclair Ferguson contra Murray would say that when Paul talks about baptism in Romans 6, he's literally talking about water baptism. He's not talking about, but because he's using synecdoche, he's implying all that John Murray wants to say it means. But Murray wants to sort of, almost in a fear of sacerdotalism, remove any physical elements and make it purely spiritual.
Interesting.
And just in my reading of a lot of Reformed Baptists, I feel like Murray's shadow just looming over that one.
Oh, absolutely. Okay, totally. Oh, that's helpful. Yes, I mean, for me, that's all messed up. So I don't have a problem with, I mean, if you draw a diagram, I think probably the Presbyterians would agree on this one. If you got, here's the cross, and then on the one side is circumcision, the other side is baptism. They're both pointing to the same thing. I agree with that 100%. So, just maybe going back to his statement here, the meaning of the sign of circumcision is not identical to the meaning of the sign of baptism. I'm not sure, I've totally, there is significant overlap, really. I would almost say complete overlap at that point, but it's just, how he develops that in terms of...
Let me tease out what he means, because there are statements and there's how you interpret those statements. So he says this.
Yep.
Circumcision signified certain promises, baptism does not. In other words, circumcision sealed the various promises that were given specifically to Abraham.
Yeah.
So if you think about what circumcision sealed and openly signed, it was that physical descendants, as many as the stars in the sky. Mm-hmm. So when you get baptized, is that part of your promise? No, that was something particular to Abraham. Yep. We might be able to put in a reverse one as it comes from Christ, as it relates to Christ. Mm-hmm. That Abraham would be the father of many nations, that kings would come from Abraham's body, an everlasting possession of the land of Canaan. So these were certain promises that were attached to circumcision, that baptism doesn't have those promises attached to it. So there is a definite relationship between circumcision and baptism, but there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes with circumcision that does not come over to be a part of baptism. And that's what he's
so the typological administration part
pretty much
of the covenant of grace is
so, I mean, outwardly moral Israelites would cherish these physical aspects and enjoy them under the old covenant. Mm-hmm. If you were a moral Israelite and you obeyed the Mosaic covenant, you would have a fulfillment of Abraham's promises to you. Now, there were spiritual blessings to be enjoyed as well, Physical blessings could be enjoyed without experiencing spiritual ones.
Yeah, totally agreed.
Just by virtue of the corporate identity of Israel,
yeah,
which is not part of what's going on in the new covenant.
Yeah. And I know it's certainly when we're thinking about the Mosaic covenant there, at least from that point on, every Kleinian's on board with that, surely, prior to that though, it gets a little bit more complicated, I think, in that, obviously you have this, they all died without the land. There was no anything,
Yeah, but I think there are natural, miraculous, theocratic blessings attending Abraham's family. Sarah was a babe.
She was a babe at old age.
At old age, but I believe that she was miraculously preserved.
Totally.
Just like the Israelites' shoes didn't wear out for 40 years, Sarah didn't wear out for 40 years, as it were.
Yeah,
so
sort
there
of
was
nucleus.
Some external, physical, material blessing that accompanied Abraham. He was rich. He was able to accumulate wealth. He didn't have the fertility aspect. That's because the Lord had a plan for his barrenness. But there were definitely other external markers.
Right, which were part of the Abrahamic promise, even at
so there's a lot more in common with the Mosaic and the Abrahamic on those issues.
Yeah, it was sort of setting the playing field for what would later happen with the Mosaic covenant. So it's not, I would agree with Kleinians in that it's not the covenant of works that starts there. I'm not with the Federalist 1689 Federal Vision guys. Sorry, I just had to throw it in there once. I'm not with them on that, but I think it is also important to recognize that you've got these beginnings of a typological administration, typological precisely because they're setting it up for the Mosaic covenant, and that that typological element, I think no one would deny is it's working at a different playing field. It's an overlay to the covenant of grace.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
for sure. He goes on to say this: all those in the new covenant experience the promises and the spiritual blessings related to the new covenant. All physical blessings that are part of the new covenant, namely a new body and a new creation, will also be enjoyed by all of the elect. So every blessing will be experienced by every participant in the new covenant. But physical and spiritual are separated in the old covenant, where some only got some.
Hey, let me also say to anyone listening, that really annoying buzz that happens every now and again. That's Nick's fault, and so I'm just saying that's not me. It's I clean my stuff up around you.
I have a fan.
Nick's line.
I have a fan. It's noisy.
You have one noisy fan.
Yeah, it's my computer fan.
There goes your one fan.
Exactly.
So, all right, now listen. The thing about that as well is just that when we say they were part of every new covenant member will experience those blessings of the new creation, etc. That's one of the reasons I don't go along with an external new covenant where let's say someone falsely professes faith, is visibly part of the church. You can't say that about that guy. He will fall away and thus show that he was never truly one of the church to begin with. I don't think that there is any external, often Peter Baptists want to talk about, hey, it was a blessing though, that they attended, they got to receive the benefits and blessings of the external covenant community at that, even during their time, as a Christian, and so tasted the heavenly gift and all those things. I don't think that is what's happening, because
it appears to be happening like that.
Sure, for sure, from the outward side of things, but in terms of the equivalent there, because what's driving that is like the equivalent of the old covenant reality. So you want to say, well, in the old covenant, they could be in the land, they could enjoy it, they could be blessed and still not be believers. And they'll say, no, well, it's the same amongst the external, physical, visible church in the new covenant. You could be part of it and enjoy it. But I mean, it's just sort of like it feels like it misses the whole thing for me. Firstly, likely that's coming from an American sort of standpoint or someplace where the church is doing really well, and it's a really good thing to be part of the external visible church. It's going to bring you lots of blessings. It might get you a discount in your bookstore and at your seminary and all that sort of thing. But in most other places, you get no political kudos or any sort of extra little blessings from going to church on Sunday. It's just bringing woes upon you at that level. And I think, that makes it easier to see that really the blessings are spiritual, and there aren't any blessings unless you believe and are actually participating in those things, the foretaste of those things that you'll ultimately experience. So yeah, you could say it very superficially, like, okay, people that come to church get good friends, and but
do we want to nuance it though in the case of someone like Judas, like prophesying, casting out demons? Like there's a genuine experience of power, though it's not in the salvific sense.
Oh, totally, absolutely. So I think, and that's where all those, and this kind of moves into a different. Well, I suppose it's kind of related with the apostasy passages, but for me anyway, I put all of that in. That is a unique instance. That's the blasphemy of the Spirit, for example, the tasting of the heavenly gift, the apostles doing miracles and signs and wonders and all that. You've got something going on that's utterly unique at that point, and so I think it's possible for them to have experienced something spiritual.
So you dodge the apostasy passages by claiming cessationism.
More or less, yeah. It's more nuanced than that. Thanks. But at the same time, I think even in those sort of unique apostolic days, I don't know that you have any blessings of the new covenant flowing through them necessarily at that point. Like even for Judas,
I've got a slightly different approach to that, but maybe for another time.
I mean, he was hanging out with Jesus. That would be solid. That would be a solid blessing.
I think I think the way that the Peter Baptists would usually approach it is they would say there's external blessings and participation, and the unbelieving covenant child has the same sort of experience, and I think that's what they're sort of working towards.
Totally. And I don't know, just not seeing that either. It's just okay, good. They get a solid. It just gets too general. It becomes like they had a good solid home and a stable environment and good friends, and
they will be held accountable for that. To those who've been given much will be required.
But is that a specifically I've tasted the new covenant external blessings and then departed from it? I don't think so. It strikes me as thoroughly different.
Visibly, it appears to be the case.
Yeah. It feels strained. The whole idea feels really strained. I mean, the new covenant is very specific about what we're talking about over here. It's heaven foreshadowed. It's heaven foretasted, at least.
Exactly.
And anything short of that is just it doesn't seem to work with the tenor of the new covenant. Even the blessings that we experience in obedience, that kind of language, where if you don't have commit adultery and you are faithful, obviously you can have a blessed marriage, and then they're like, well, if you just there we go, there's your external blessings in the new covenant. You're blessed upon obedience, like Israel is blessed upon obedience in the land. And I'm going, no, that's just something else. We're in the realm of like common grace, just Proverbs, really, at the end of the day. The guy who's wise,
it's flattening the word blessing. It's just saying there's salvific blessing, and hey, there's all these other blessings as well, and they're just quite similar, and there's no real difference.
Because we're just trying to get them in there. Yeah, so no problem to call them blessings as long as we're not talking a technical discussion, in this context, to try and create an externality in the new covenant that's equal to the old covenant and its external blessings. Yeah.
No, good. Alrighty. Well, the second point that he makes, just carrying on, looking at the discontinuity between circumcision and baptism. He said, baptism did not replace circumcision as to its function among the covenant people of God. Jesus' command to baptize was to baptize disciples who follow Christ and his teaching, not the children of believers. Okay, so there's the way that circumcision functioned. It functioned in a family capacity in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, it's disciple-based. It's all about believers and those who follow and those who become disciples and those who commit themselves to Christ.
Yeah.
And even as we look at the rest of the New Testament practice of baptism, it confirms this. So he says here, household baptisms will be dealt with shortly. And he just raises a number of problems for those who insist that circumcision has replaced baptism. He looks at Timothy's circumcision. He looks at in Acts 21, Paul tolerating Jewish Christians who still circumcise their kids.
Mm-hmm.
He looks at the Council of Jerusalem and the silence about baptism replacing circumcision, if that was the case. And likewise, the Galatian heresy could have been easily refuted by just showing that baptism has replaced circumcision. So he just shows how those silences, although it's terrible to argue from silence, do seem to come together in a harmony at that point.
Yeah,
cool.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
All right, so the third section of his paper looks at the Peter Baptist misuse of key biblical texts. And this is where he sort of hits on the proof texts and just offers a few short yet insightful comments on each one. So the first one is Acts 2, 38 and 39. So Peter Baptist used this verse to say that God has a special blessing for children, which sets them apart from unbelievers' children and puts them in the covenant.
It's kind of what we were talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. So Welty stresses, looking at these two verses, how the three parties of you, your children, and those from afar must be taken together as called. So there's this umbrella term called, which should apply to all three. And if so, then whether it's referring to the external call or the internal call, this text either proves too little or too much for their case. So if the call is referring to the external call, then all who are far off are included and shouldn't be baptized simply by hearing the gospel's external call. So it can't mean that. And if it's the internal call, this is talking of God's elect and does not allow for all believers' children to be indiscriminately baptized because they're not all elect. So unless we're willing to assume election for all covenant children, which is unbiblical, unless you're Federal Vision, then it proves too much or too little. If you just focus on this notion of call in that passage. So those are his comments there. Anything you want to add?
No, that's good. I mean, yeah, this is that's a big one, and it works together with the tenor of a lot of the other kind of thing that we see. When this idea gets neglected a little bit, like, the idea is that everyone's repenting and believing, right? That's the context in which all of this is delivered. You see straight afterwards they repent and then they're baptized and they're added to the church, and then, as you said earlier, the household baptisms are brought up, but the context is that everyone's rejoicing and everyone's being added to the church. There's no word in which anything is happening differently other than a direct continuation of this John the Baptist styled repent, basically, is the idea. I suppose, and I think it's definitely something, sometimes you'll actually see, I know in Michael Horton's book, for example, in The God of Promise, he just quotes half of the verse. He just literally stops there before it talks about it, and all who are far off,
Yeah.
So you often see that kind of thing, and it's just, I realize they're not always, quoting that in a polemical context against Baptists, and they want to focus on the you and your children part, but I think at the end of the day, you got to be careful with that, because there is a logic here that I don't think there's anything, I've never read anything convincing against that argument. So, I think it has to be reckoned with. The other thing, though, is maybe, we'll probably deal with this incrementally as we go, is just the most persuasive idea when it comes to the inclusion of your children, for me, has always been Klein's argument, because it sort of removes it from much of what we're talking about. It sort of brings it together with the John the Baptist ethos, and it kind of finds a way not to have to deal with the issue of what exactly baptism does for the child, the special promise that sets them apart. He just takes it right out of those categories, and he talks about, just a matter of consecrating. Really, as I thought about it, it's exactly the way some Baptists would talk about baby dedications. That's actually the way Klein talks about. It sounds crazy to say, but baptism. And he comes up with the most profound case imaginable for baby dedications. So I feel kind of bad that I don't dedicate babies, but still, basically that's the idea. It's just, this family thing, it stays in place. That's why Peter says what he says. That's why the household baptisms happen in his mind, because what the as the vassal comes to the suzerain, so he commits everything in his care to the suzerain. That's what he's doing. He's basically dedicating his babies, and they're not blessed in their setting apart in some sort of strange, unique externality way, but rather that they are simply at that point included as part of the covenant and therefore consecrated. So it makes sense. It makes the most sense as an argument, but it just isn't what baptism means, in my opinion. So it's a great argument. It's the best argument, but it's just not what baptism means. So we'll come back to all of that, and I suppose intertwined with all of that is the legitimacy of the household principle. In denying all of this as a family unit thing, I think one of the things I feel quite, we're not at all. It's in tune with what we were saying earlier. We're not at all saying that there's no household authority principle. There is. We're just saying it's not the grounds for baptism, in the new covenant. That's the simple reality. It's not like there's no family solidarity. There is. It's just not the grounds for baptism. It's not like we're not consecrating our kids. We are. It's just not the grounds for baptism. And so really that's what it keeps coming down to for me. All of these things are good, but they don't form the cumulative case that they need to be able to link up with what the New Testament is saying baptism is.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, as I look at Acts 2, and it's a verse that I've tried to take quite seriously, I appreciate that it stands at the gate of the book of Acts as the beginning of the practice for how the gospel moved forward and how the apostles incorporated people into the church. So in many ways, it's one of the more important verses just because of where it's situated. I'll ask myself this question: why would he say you and your children? What's the underlying theological assumption that's being revealed by that throwaway comment, you and your children? There does seem to be some reason why he does that. And as I've wrestled with that, you've got one of two choices. You can either come with the theological context, assuming continuity between Old and New Testament, and say, well, there must be like Abraham and his seed. It's you and your children.
Or like Noah and his family.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds pretty good. That feels good. It feels biblical. I mean, there seems to be a ready-made pattern for that. But
Noah and his family were adults, though, right?
Boom. We'll say more on that just now. But the thing that stood out for me is not the theological context by assuming continuity, but the exegetical context. And Peter beforehand in Acts chapter 2 around verse 17 talks about your sons and your daughters prophesying, how the Spirit will be poured out on all flesh. So as you look at those categories of you, your children, and everyone who's afar off that God is calling, it's you, your sons and daughters, and all flesh. So why does Peter say you and your children? It's not because he's assuming continuity between Abraham and your seed. It's because he's seeing a fulfillment of Joel's promises. And here's the clincher if that's the case. If we're going to take the exegetical context and not assume a theological context, sons and daughters prophesying are not infants.
Right.
It's an older expression of children in the context. There are the only children in the context are people who are able to articulate understandable thought.
Yeah, so adult children in that sense are in view.
Well, yes. Yeah.
Just from that basic context. But then also, I think one of the things that, I don't know, it feels kind of obvious in many ways is that why include children? Well, because the same thing applies to your children, And like, if anything, it seems like the opposite point of, hey, just assume the children of Abraham just kind of walk on through, without themselves having to appropriate this gospel message and themselves being cut to the heart and themselves repenting. It's like, as the Gentile that's far off and you, so your children is the idea. It almost feels to be exactly the opposite of even just driving the reason behind that wording,
Yeah, for sure. I think they would probably say that, I mean, the way that the Peter Baptist mind works is they would immediately go back to Jesus and they would say, well, the disciples learned their lesson when Jesus rebuked them for not letting the little children come. So now they're including the children. So, see, lesson learned. Now they're including the kids. No, it's exegetical context.
Yeah.
Your sons and daughters are prophesying, you and your children. I think that's, to my mind, that seems to be the most honest. Because, I mean, they're all possible options. They all sound biblical. But which is the most reasonable given the context?
Yeah, I'm just thinking of Spurgeon's sermon. What did he say? Bring them to Jesus, not the font. Bring the little children to Jesus, not the font. But on that same point, I mean, you kind of a lot of it goes, I think one of the things I would have in mind that most Peter Baptists that I've talked to will say in response to that, and that they're like, well, you're saying essentially that the blessing is growing, it's going from the greater to the lesser. I don't know if you've heard that argument before.
Well,
But
he deals with that at the end. He calls
does he?
that sentimental argumentation.
Right. Yeah, well, even because basically what we're saying is, they're in their mindset, they're me and my family. This is for me and my family, right?
Yeah.
And now we're coming along going, no, this is for you and your family if they repent. But potentially we're driving a sword between you and your family.
Amen.
That's what we're saying. And they go, oh, well then, that's good. That's taking this great big blessing in the Judaistic mind and turning it into something that's kind of like halved and chopped. But what is the blessing? What is the blessing itself? Is the blessing that you have a family unit go through in an external covenant, or is the blessing that now that the fulfillment of that external covenant has come and you and your children have part of it if you repent? Well, I don't know. It seems like it just falls.
And I mean, Welty adds this point. He says, well, there's a more important relationship than you and your children. It's you and your spouse. You're literally one flesh.
Literally.
And if your spouse does not repent, they're not part of the covenant. So yes, God divides marriages, God divides families in the sense that they don't join in the same covenant status unless they repent. And that's not, it's as we get closer to the truth, the kernel has to fall away.
Totally. Yeah, huge. So I'm seeing we're on 40 minutes over here. We kind of get warmed up. I'm starting to preach right now. I'm feeling the preacher in me come out. So and I'm seeing also what's ahead here is looking good. So maybe we should call it there. We didn't because we still got
part 3.
We got so where did we get to? Part 3.
Yeah, we're part 3. We finished the first text. Next week we'll pick up with 1 Corinthians 7:14. Yeah,
brilliant. That'll make a good sort of starting point for the rest of it there. Brilliant. There we go. So find yourself a Baptist church, folks. Get stuck in.
Go to church.
Although to be honest, I'll say this as well. I mean, like most Baptist churches that I know, I'd still go to a Peter Baptist.
Not a Baptist Union church.
Dude. Oh my goodness, no, please.
We're a Baptist Union church, but don't go to other Baptist Union churches.
No, go to a Peter Baptist church. They have the better churches. I mean, again, fair enough.
Unless it's a Roman Catholic church or an Anglican church or a mainline Presbyterian.
Well, to be honest, sometimes I think I would rather go to any one of those churches than a Baptist church these days. Baptists are not doing well, folks. I'll be the first to admit it. It's just like, if you manage to find a drop in the ocean, which is a Reformed Baptist church, then good on you. Well done. Go to that church. You might find that it's not the best church, but it's still, dude, it's a Reformed Baptist church. You got to hold on to something. And I mean, every other Baptist church you're going to find is, I can guarantee you it's going to be messed up. You've got the dispensational Baptists, you got the fundamentalist Baptists, you got the, oh my goodness, let's just not even go there. It's just rather just go to the Reformed Church, rather just become a Peter Baptist. Forget about the Anyway, so want to keep that in view, because at the end of the day, but it is tough though, right? Because if you've got this conviction, and this is a big existential, massive problem for so many people. Here they are. They've got the conviction that moves them in a Reformed Baptist direction, but that's not usually. I mean, there's more to the story. They have to find a church, and more often than not, they can't find a church that is Baptistic and Reformed, and it's difficult. You've got to give way to that as a serious problem. So anyway, hopefully we can all be gracious with one another while we're figuring it out, and yet not move away from the importance of the subject, not get cavalier about it either.
Yeah, for sure.
Like
it's a visible church. That's what baptism defines. It's important. Yeah.
Totally. All right. Should we close off with the song?
Let's.
Okay, who's gonna sing? What about you sing? Why can't we all get along? Or
welcome to the family. So glad you came.
Beautiful. Okay, that'll do.